Let's open with a question. Could the sacred plants and fungi humans have used for millennia actually be the original doorway to the divine and the roots of religion itself? Across thousands of years and every continent, humans have turned to certain plants and substances, not just to escape reality, but to enter what they understood as a more real world, one inhabited by gods, ancestors, and spirits. From the deserts of North Africa to the forests of the Amazon, from Vedic and Zoroastrian fire altars to Greek mystery temples, from ancient global spirituality to contemporary clinical trials, psychedelics have functioned as tools for revelation, healing, and initiation. Long before the word psychedelic was coined in the 20th century, cultures around the world treated certain plants and preparations as doors to the sacred, sacraments through which human beings could commune with the divine. Modern scholars often use the term entheogen, formed from Greek roots meaning that which generates the divine within, to emphasize that these are not merely drugs, but ritual instruments embedded in cosmology, myth, and community. A Huichol shaman in Mexico was once told by a reporter that peyote was a drug. The shaman responded that aspirin is a drug, peyote is sacred. These ancient practices are not isolated curiosities. They form an arching pattern in which entheogens serve as mediating technologies between worlds, structuring initiation, legitimization of spiritual authority, and the transmission of myth. In many cases, these sacred substances are woven into agricultural cycles and ecological knowledge. Among Amazonian peoples who work with ayahuasca, for example, the brew is described as a teacher or mother, whose visions instruct not only individual seekers, but the community as a whole in matters of cosmology, ethics, and ecology, blending plant pharmacology with a richly elaborated spiritual nature. As institutional religions develop more formal priesthoods, scriptures, and doctrinal systems, the status of entheogenic sacraments becomes more contested. As monotheistic traditions consolidate authority and emphasize textual revelation, psychoactive substances are often pushed to the margins, reclassified as sorcery, pharmakeia, or magic, and sometimes violently suppressed, even as symbolic traces of earlier entheogenic practice remain embedded in ritual language and imagery. This tension between embodied visionary access to the sacred and institutional control of religious experience becomes one of the major themes in the long history of psychedelics and spirituality. Researchers in the 20th and 21st centuries test whether substances like psilocybin from magic mushrooms can reliably occasion what earlier theologians and mystics called mystical experiences, and large controlled studies at institutions such as Johns Hopkins confirm that many participants report encounters with unity, sacredness, and deep insight that map closely onto classic descriptions from figures like Plotinus, Teresa of Avila, and Rumi. For contemporary spiritual seekers, this convergence of archaeology, ethnography, and neuroscience opens a new horizon. The question is not whether psychedelics can heal depression or addiction, but whether they have always been among humanity's most powerful tools for discovering whatever cultures have named God, the ground of being, or ultimate reality. Entheogens, once framed as relics of primitive religion or as dangerous deviations, reappear as central threads in the weave of religious history, challenging neat separations between orthodox faith and pagan or heretical practice. From the standpoint of later esoteric and occult traditions, these primordial practices can be seen as prototypes for what will eventually become alchemical elixirs, visionary philosophers' wines, witches' potions, and the carefully regulated ecstatic states of mystics and contemplatives who seek gnosis, or unio mystica, meaning mystical union, even without explicit plant allies. The shaman's ascent to the sky, or descent into the underworld under the influence of a plant sacrament, anticipates later visionary journeys through celestial spheres, palaces of deities, or subtle energy centers, suggesting that the grammar of spiritual ascent and transformation was, at least in part, shaped by very concrete experiences of altered perception and consciousness. So, to understand psychedelics as spiritual tools, it helps to begin not with modern clinical trials or counterculture experiments, but with the oldest evidence available, those traces of sacramental plants and visionary potions that run like hidden rivers beneath the world's great traditions. In this first part of the journey, we will move from the prehistoric hints and earliest literate cultures through Vedic Soma, Iranian Haoma, and Greek mysteries, before turning to indigenous traditions, veiled allusions in Orthodox scriptures, and the surprising return of entheogens in contemporary psychology. Let's begin. The earliest possible indications of entheogenic spirituality come not from texts, but from images, artifacts, and residues. Paleolithic rock art, Neolithic ritual sites, and chemical traces on artifacts suggest mind-altering substances were present in contexts already strongly associated with the sacred. Around 100,000 BCE, at Shanadar Cave in present-day Iraq, pollen analysis associated with Neanderthal burials suggests the intentional use of psychoactive and medicinal plants, pointing toward ritual-altered states linked to early healing practices. Around 40,000 to 30,000 BCE, in Upper Paleolithic Europe, cave art at sites such as Lascaux and Chauvet depicts figures interpreted by many scholars as proto-shamanic trance imagery, likely connected to plant-induced altered states. Around 9000 BCE, in Tassili Najer, in present-day Algeria, rock art seen towards the bottom left of the slide shows mushroom-headed anthropomorphic figures, widely interpreted as evidence of early entheogenic mushroom use within ritual and initiation contexts. Around 7000 BCE, in the Bolivian Andes, archaeological finds at Cueva del Chileno indicate the use of psychoactive snuffs and plants, suggesting structured visionary practices among early South American hunter-gatherers. Around 6000 BCE, in the Sahara and Near East, residues of fermented beverages at early ritual sites indicate psychoactive alcohol-based intoxication used communally for ceremonial and cosmological purposes prior to written language. In these scenarios, the altered states facilitated by such substances could have served as powerful tools for reinforcing emerging hierarchies, binding groups together through shared extraordinary experience, and generating origin myths that justified new social arrangements. Across northern Eurasia, as seen in Siberian shamanic practice, ethnographic accounts suggest what some theorists have imagined as a deep time continuum: the figure of the ritual specialist who uses drumming, dance, fasting, and sometimes psychoactive plants or mushrooms, such as Amanita muscaria, to journey to other worlds on behalf of the community. The word shaman originates from the Evenki language of Siberia, where it denotes a trained ritual specialist who enters altered states of consciousness through disciplined practice and ordeal in order to heal, commune with the divine, and mediate between the human and spirit worlds for the community. Whether or not specific Paleolithic groups use precisely the same species, the structural role of visionary states in negotiating with animal masters, ancestral spirits, and cosmic forces appears remarkably stable over time, supporting the idea that entheogenic facilitation of trance may be as old as organized ritual itself. Theories such as Terence McKenna's stoned ape hypothesis suggest that psilocybin or magic mushrooms played a role in the evolution of human cognition, remain speculative and controversial, but they highlight a broader intuition that encounters with psychoactive plants have likely been entangled with the development of symbolic thinking, language, and religious imagination from very early on. Later esoteric traditions can be read as refinements of primordial visionary practice, where plant-induced ascent and descent anticipate alchemical elixirs, philosophers' wines, ritual potions, and the regulated ecstasies of mystics seeking gnosis or mystical union. whether framed as Atman with Brahman in Hinduism or the Neoplatonic return to the One. Across cultures, the shamanic journey establishes a durable grammar of transformation that reappears in accounts of death, rebirth, entities, and cosmic passage, reported by modern psychonauts and clinical subjects alike, suggesting not direct continuity, but a recurring symbolic pattern elicited by altered states, and later organized into religious and esoteric systems. The shaman's symbolic death and rebirth, dismemberment by spirits, and reassembly with new powers prefigure alchemical narratives of putrefaction and coagulation, as well as mystical descriptions of ego death and rebirth into a new identity in God or the Absolute. In several living indigenous traditions, the boundary between shamanic practice and esoteric systemization is deliberately porous. Iboga within Bwiti traditions in Central Africa, and ayahuasca within traditional indigenous structures and syncretic churches in Central and South America function not merely as intoxicants, but as sacramental technologies that structure encounters with ancestors, ethical reckoning, graded initiations, and a multi-layered spiritual cosmology, closely resembling the logic of later mystery religions. The iboga root, containing the psychoactive alkaloid ibogaine, is used in Bwiti initiation to induce extended visionary journeys during which the initiate encounters ancestors, judges past behavior, and receives guidance, embedding the experience within a moral and cosmological framework that strongly resembles later mystery religions and esoteric fraternities. Similarly, in Amazonian ayahuasca churches that blend indigenous, Christian, and spiritist elements, the brew functions as a kind of Eucharistic entheogenic synthesis, linking ancient plant teachers to imported doctrinal and esoteric systems that speak of astral realms, karmic debts, and subtle bodies. These living examples offer a rare anthropological window into how early visionary practices could mature into formalized sacramental and initiatory systems in emerging literate civilizations. Moving onward to preserved literature, some scholars suggest that the Epic of Gilgamesh, dating to 2100 BCE, may preserve entheogenic knowledge, particularly through its descriptions of visionary journeys and encounters with divine or otherworldly beings and luminous realities. The plant that grants immortality, found in the depths of the sea and stolen by a serpent, has been interpreted as a symbolic or literal reference to a psychoactive or consciousness-expanding substance used to bridge mortality and divinity that shares thematic patterns with the biblical tale of Adam and Eve. Some researchers propose that entheogens played a role in ancient Egyptian ritual and iconography, with mycologist Paul Stamets suggesting mushrooms may be encoded in hieroglyphs, while residue analysis of a 2nd century BCE Bes vase hints at psychoactive substances like Peganum harmala used in domestic or cultic contexts. Additionally, blue lotus and mandrake appear frequently in Egyptian art and temple reliefs, often associated with ecstatic or transformative experiences, suggesting their use in ceremonies to induce altered states of consciousness. Acacia is depicted in Egyptian hieroglyphs, often as a stylized tree used both as a determinative for wood and as a symbolic motif, particularly in funerary and ritual contexts, such as the pyramid texts and coffin texts, where it is associated with sacred structures, offerings, and connections to divine regeneration. It is plausible that ancient Egyptians used acacia species, several of which contain dimethyltryptamine or DMT, and other tryptamines, in ritual or initiatory frameworks. As the first Indo-European civilizations emerge into the light of written history, the Vedic and Iranian traditions preserve some of the most influential testimonies to a sacramental drink that appears, in many respects, entheogenic in function. These are Soma in the Rig Veda of Hinduism, the oldest religious text still in continuous and reverent use, and Haoma in the Zend-Avesta of Zoroastrianism. These two sacraments, which scholars believe may be one and the same concoction, are described not merely as beverages, but as deities and living presences who speak, grant vision, and place the sacrificer among the gods. In the Rig Veda, Soma is repeatedly praised as the immortal elixir that confers immortality, pressed from a plant, filtered, mixed with other ingredients, and consumed by priests, who then sing inspired hymns describing luminous realms, cosmic order, and the overcoming of death. Around the same time, or a few centuries later, Zoroastrian texts describe Haoma with strikingly similar language, a sacred plant whose juice is ritually extracted and offered, whose consumption purifies and strengthens the soul for its journey through the cosmic conflict between truth and falsehood. While the precise botanical identity of Soma or Haoma remains fiercely debated, proposed candidates include Amanita muscaria mushrooms by R. Gordon Wasson in his book Soma, Divine Mushroom of Immortality, various ephedra species, Syrian rue, and psychoactive combinations like Amanita muscaria mushrooms and psilocybin mushrooms, as proposed by scholar Terence McKenna. Most modern discussions converge on the idea that whatever the plant was, it functioned as a visionary sacrament, structuring priestly experience, theological imagination, and the liturgical calendar. Thematically, Soma Haoma rites encode many elements that will become staples of later esoteric and mystical traditions. The ingestion of a specially prepared substance in a tightly controlled ritual setting, the expectation of access to deeper truth, heightened insight, and even union with the divine, and a strong emphasis on correct preparation, purity, and the moral character of the officiants. The Soma drinking priest is a kind of proto-Gnostic, using a plant sacrament to ascend into a realm of timeless truth, while the Haoma ritualist participates in a cosmic drama that maps the effects of the drink onto dualistic metaphysics of light and darkness. Later esoteric currents, from alchemical elixir lore to some strands of tantric praxis, inherit this idea that a carefully prepared substance, whether understood as literal, symbolic, or psychoenergetic, can catalyze gnosis, transmutation, and liberation. Even contemporary psychedelic practitioners who work with psilocybin, LSD, or ayahuasca in quasi-ritual settings often describe their experiences in language uncannily reminiscent of Vedic and Iranian hymns, speaking of light, immortality, cosmic order, and the dissolution of the fear of death, which suggests that entheogenic states exert a consistent pressure on religious vocabulary across millennia. Moving westward to the ancient Greek world, we find the Eleusinian mysteries, active from around 1600 BCE to the 4th century CE, standing as one of the most compelling and enigmatic examples of a state-sanctioned initiatory cult centered on a sacramental drink called Kykeon, which many scholars believe was psychedelic. For nearly 2 millennia, initiates such as Plato, Socrates, and Aristotle traveled to Eleusis to participate in a sequence of rites culminating in a nocturnal ceremony in the inner temple or telesterion, where things said, things shown, and things done were strictly guarded by oaths of secrecy. Classical authors hint that those who underwent the mysteries left with a radically transformed attitude toward death, confident of a blessed fate in the afterlife. The Kykeon, a brew associated with barley and other ingredients, has become a focus of intense modern inquiry. Scholars R. Gordon Wasson, Albert Hoffman, and Carl A.P. Ruck, in their book The Road to Eleusis, published 1978-79, argue that ergot fungus infecting the grain could have supplied lysergic alkaloids, the psychoactive compound found in LSD, capable of inducing powerful visual and emotional effects, especially within a highly controlled ritual environment, though others caution that the evidence, while intriguing, remains circumstantial. What is clear is that Eleusis combined a sacred narrative, the myth of Demeter, Persephone, and Hades, with a carefully orchestrated ritual environment, and a sacramental drink that together produced experiences participants regarded as both revelation and initiation. Persephone represents summer and the season of vegetative fullness, when light and life are most present in the upper world. Her descent under Hades, marking winter not as annihilation, but as hidden gestation. Her return through Demeter restores the rhythms of sowing and renewal in spring and autumn, expressing an agricultural and cosmological cycle of loss, containment, and rebirth. This metaphorical tale encapsulates truths about cosmic cycles as well as consciousness, the macrocosm and the microcosm, and served as the foundation through which the initiate would journey with the aid of a supposed entheogenic sacrament. There is a wonderful book titled Persephone's Quest, Entheogens and the Origins of Religion, by authors R. Gordon Wasson, Stella Cromrish, and Jonathan Ott, as well as Carl A. P. Ruck, that discusses the role played by psychoactive mushrooms in the religious rituals of ancient Greece, Eurasia, and Mesoamerica. Beyond Eleusis, the ancient Mediterranean offers additional hints of entheogenic practice woven into religious life. The Dionysian mysteries of Greece, active from around 600 BCE or earlier until the 4th century CE, and later Bacchic mysteries of ancient Rome, also revolved around ecstatic entheogenic states, dissolving normal social boundaries and giving participants a sense of divine possession. In his book, Sacred Mushrooms of the Goddess, author Carl A. P. Ruck describes these rites thus: the theater of Dionysus was a venue for public drinking. The wine for the theater had a special name. It was called trimma, after the additives ground into it. Throughout the several days of performances, lasting all day long, the audience signaled their acceptance of the gods' gifts by drinking, as they sat on the hillside. The nature of these experiences was one of mass spiritual possession. Orphic traditions speak of purifications, reincarnation, and liberation from the cycle of rebirth that resonate with themes later developed in philosophical and esoteric schools, while the entheogenic sacrament here was now transformed, as in other religious systems, from literal to metaphorical in nature. Here, physical substances like wine, as with the later Islamic Sufis, were often framed primarily as symbols rather than literal sacraments. In Greek mythology, ambrosia, the food or drink of the gods, is frequently linked to divine insight, immortality, and ecstatic experience, leading some scholars to interpret it as a metaphor for entheogenic substances consumed in ritual or mystical contexts. Similarly, Homer's Odyssey describes the protective herb moly or moly, a mythical plant scholars have hypothesized with connection to ancient practices involving psychoactive or medicinal plants or entheogens, alongside other possible references such as the Kykeon of the Eleusinian mysteries, which together suggest that psychoactive plants and fungi may have underpinned sacred rites and visionary experiences throughout ancient Greek religious practice. In his book, The Beyond Within, psychiatrist Sidney Cohen writes about the oracle at Delphi, stating, "In order to invoke the gift of prophecy, an old woman was attired as a maiden. She drank from the underground stream. Whether the waters contributed to her ability to procure divinatory powers is unknown. What certainly helped was seating her upon a tripod, placed over a fissure in the rock, from which carbon dioxide gas emanated. This may have induced a seizure-like trance, and the subsequent act of divination, since high concentrations of carbon dioxide are quite capable of changing consciousness. Whenever the gas vent gave out, sacred laurel leaves were scorched in a hot copper bowl and inhaled." Manly P. Hall, in The Secret Teachings of All Ages from 1928, adds, "It is generally admitted that the effect of the Delphian oracle upon Greek culture was profoundly constructive." Citing James Gardner, Hall continues, "Its responses revealed many a tyrant and foretold his fate. Through its means, many an unhappy being was saved from destruction, and many a perplexed mortal guided in the right way. It encouraged useful institutions and promoted the progress of useful discoveries. Its moral influence was on the side of virtue, and its political influence in favor of the advancement of civil liberty. The broader pattern is one in which substances, whether wine, possibly ergotized grain, and other inhaled or ingested botanicals, serve as catalysts for experiences framed as direct encounters with deities or with the deeper structure of reality. Later Hermetic and alchemical texts inherit much of this imaginal vocabulary, translating agricultural sacraments into the language of metals, planets, and inner transformation. In a sense, the Eleusinian Kykeon becomes an archetype of the entheogenic Eucharist, a liquid that, when consumed in the right setting, reveals the underlying truth of life and death. Modern psychedelic researchers and spiritual practitioners often look back to Eleusis as a classical precedent for carefully structured set and setting, legal toleration, and the integration of visionary states into civic and philosophical life. The contemporary revival of interest in entheogens as tools for confronting mortality, especially in palliative care contexts, can be read as a distinct echo of Eleusis, where facing death under the influence of a sacrament was understood as a gateway to a more conscious life. Moving onward and eastward to China and India, we also find psychedelic spiritual roots. The earliest use of cannabis as a medicine is attributed to the legendary Chinese emperor Xin Nung, who is thought to have lived around 2700 BCE, seen at the bottom left image of the slide. The Chinese word ma describes the hemp plant, and evidence suggests cultivation in Taiwan around that time, through mentions in ancient poetry like the Book of Odes. Between 700 and 500 BCE, excavated incense burners demonstrate that Chinese shamans were using cannabis ritualistically. See second image from the bottom left of the slide. Early Taoist texts mention numinous mushrooms, strange herbs, and elixirs that confer visions, longevity, or access to celestial realms, though these references are often veiled and intermingled with metaphor. Archaeological and textual evidence also points to the ritual use of hallucinogenic wine, psychedelic seeds, and mushrooms in burial and ceremonial contexts across Han and pre-Han periods, showing that entheogens were integrated into spiritual, medical, and cosmological practice, rather than merely recreational consumption. As the risks of toxic substances became apparent, Taoist adepts turned inward, transforming the body into a laboratory where the circulation of qi, refinement of essence, and stabilization of spirit functioned as an internal entheogenic process, reproducing the insights once sought through external elixirs. This internal alchemy, or nadon, emerges symbolically from earlier external or weighed-on practices that experimented with mineral and botanical preparations in pursuit of immortality and transcendence. This change from literal sacrament to metaphorical sacrament becomes a running theme in the history of global spirituality. Following Vedic Soma rituals, Indian spiritual practice employed entheogens such as datura in Shaiva and folk ceremonies, psychotropic mushrooms in some tantric lineages, and ephedra-like Soma substitutes, all used to induce heightened consciousness, deity communion, and visionary insight within ritual, mantra, and subtle body practices. In ancient India, cannabis or bhang was used in food and drink as early as 1000 BCE, appearing in ancient Indian texts from that era and later. In Hindu ascetic traditions, particularly among the Naga sadhus, cannabis has long been used as a sacramental aid to meditation, spiritual discipline, and ritual worship of Shiva, where cannabis consumption is believed to facilitate altered states of consciousness, deepen mystical insight, and support the pursuit of liberation and direct experience of the divine. Additionally, Ayurvedic and alchemical traditions explored entheogenic plant combinations in ritual and meditation contexts, such as cannabis, nutmeg, and datura mixtures, as well as ritualized ingestion of fermented beverages and psychoactive seeds, reflecting a continuous integration of altered states into cosmological and initiatic practices. In Buddhist texts, Amrita, the elixir of immortality, is often described as a divine substance conferring spiritual insight and transcendence, which some scholars interpret as a symbolic or literal reference to entheogenic plants used in ritual contexts, as well as a reflection of the Hindu Soma. I attended a psychedelic Buddhism conference last year in which this topic was widely discussed by experts in the field. The fifth precept of Buddhism warns against intoxication, but many at the conference were under the impression that entheogenic experience grounds one deeper into true reality, rather than providing a recreational escape, and thus entheogenic consumption did not contradict this fifth precept. Vajrayana texts and tantric practices hint, often symbolically, at psychoactive use to accelerate meditation, induce visions, and deepen connection with enlightened deities. The two books seen on the bottom right of the slide, Crowley's Secret Drugs of Buddhism and Baudiner's Zigzag Zen, both argue that altered states induced by entheogens have historically played a hidden yet formative role in Buddhist meditative and initiatic practices, shaping insight and the experiential dimensions of enlightenment. Eastern esoteric traditions, therefore, provide a conceptual framework of subtle energy channels, chakras, mandalas, and levels of reality that contemporary psychedelic practitioners often find useful in making sense of their own experiences. Later esoteric currents inherit this idea that a carefully prepared substance, whether understood as literal, symbolic, or psychoenergetic, can catalyze gnosis, transmutation, and liberation. This transition from outer to inner sacrament mirrors a pattern seen in many traditions. What begins as a physically ingested entheogen becomes an internalized, symbolic, or energetic sacrament, so that the methods of mysticism and occultism can survive, even in contexts where psychoactive plants or potions are banned, unavailable, or forgotten. Across the Americas, the entheogenic landscape is exceptionally rich, with the highest geographical diversity of plants with entheogenic properties in the world. Pre-Columbian and contemporary indigenous cultures integrate a variety of psychoactive species into systems of healing, divination, initiation, and cosmology. Among the Algonquin Indians, an intoxicating medicine known as Wisicon or Wisicon, which is a species of datura called jimsonweed, was given to young men, who then became violently deranged for 20 days. At least 12 tribes of Native Americans in northern Mexico, New Mexico, and Texas practice the vision-seeking red bean dance, centered on the ingestion of a drink prepared from the seeds of the mescal bean, which is a highly toxic substance and was later replaced by the peyote cactus in many of these traditional contexts. The mescaline-rich peyote cactus, scientifically known as Lophophora williamsii, is a central sacrament among Huichol, Tarahumara, and later pan-tribal Native American church communities, ingested in all-night ceremonies, blending indigenous and Christian elements to produce visions, moral insight, and communal communion. Despite its sacred status, peyote was first banned by the Roman Catholic Church during the Spanish Inquisition in 1620, reflecting enduring colonial hostility toward entheogenic practices. In pre-Incan Andean cultures, the San Pedro cactus, also containing mescaline, was consumed in ceremonies that linked participants to the mountains, stars, and ancestral powers, guiding water and fertility. In Mexico and the Southwest, both datura and salvia divinorum are used in divination, prophecy, and ritualistic curing. In Mesoamerica, psilocybin mushrooms, or teonanacatl, have been long used in Mazatec, Mixtec, and other ceremonial frameworks, with Western awareness beginning in the 1950s via R. Gordon Wasson, and are ingested under guided ritual by curanderos to facilitate visionary communion with spirits, ancestors, and saints. The Mixtecs of Mexico eat puffballs to hear voices from heaven that answer their questions. The Huaycas of Brazil and Venezuela snuff the powdered resin of a jungle tree to ritualize death, induce a trance for diagnosing disease, and thank the spirits for victory in war. The Huitotos of Colombia eat the same powerful resin to talk with the little people. The Kamza of Colombia ceremonially use potent Brugmansia cultivars for deep altered states and divination, alongside other regional psychoactive plants that inform diagnostic and healing rites. Peruvian medicine men drink simora to make themselves owners of another's identity. Indians of eastern Brazil drink jurema to have glorious visions of the spirit world before going into battle with their enemies. The bark of the virola tree is ground by Venezuelan and Amazonian indigenous groups into a powder which is then used as a snuff inhaled through a reed. These examples and more can be found in Richard Evan Schulte's 1976 book, Hallucinogenic Plants: A Golden Guide, seen in the middle of the slide. In the northwest and western Amazon, ayahuasca, combining Banisteriopsis caapi with DMT-containing leaves like Psychotria viridis, is central to traditions from the Shipibo Canibo to syncretic churches such as the Santo Daime and Unio do Vegetal, guiding learning and moral instruction through visions interpreted as messages from plant spirits or a Christianized cosmic Christ. Geometric Shipibo art called Kane, shamanic Shipibo songs called Icaros, and the luminous ayahuasca paintings of artist Pablo Amaringo convey these Amazonian spiritual experiences into the material world. The mushroom stones, seen at the bottom right of the slide, are ritual stone sculptures found primarily in the Guatemalan highlands of Mesoamerica, dating roughly between 1000 BCE and 500 CE, and are generally attributed to early Maya cultures as symbolic representations of sacred mushrooms used in ritual and cosmological contexts. The Xochopili statue, seen next to the mushroom stones on the slide, and dating to between 1450 to 1500 CE, is widely interpreted as depicting a constellation of Mesoamerican entheogens, including psilocybin mushrooms, ololiuqui or morning glory seeds, tobacco, cacao, and possibly other sacred plants, symbolizing the role of visionary intoxication in Aztec ritual, divine communion, and the ecstatic experience of sacred art, song, and flower. These American entheogenic traditions show how plant sacraments serve as medicine, identity, and spiritual technology, echoing classical, Asian, and Siberian themes of deity encounters, layered worlds, symbolic death and rebirth, and ethical transformation. While contemporary communities adapt these models into medicine circles and plant teacher lineages, navigating modern challenges of cultural appropriation, legality, and ecological responsibility. As the ancient world gave way to late antiquity and the medieval period, explicit ritual use of psychoactive sacraments in many regions declined or was driven underground, but the symbolic and structural patterns established by entheogenic practices continued to shape religious and esoteric thought. Scholars have proposed that several Old Testament substances, including manna, anointing oils, and sacred incenses, may encode entheogenic knowledge, serving as tools for ritual elevation, prophetic visions, and divine communion. References to the use of frankincense, myrrh, and other aromatic plants suggest a broader pattern in which psychoactive or consciousness-altering materials were integrated symbolically or literally into the spiritual practices of ancient Israel. Several Old Testament passages, most clearly the Mandrake episodes in Genesis and Song of Songs, reflect Near Eastern ritual knowledge of psychoactive plants associated with fertility, divination, and altered states. Several scholars and ethnobotanists have suggested that the Old Testament's references to Kane Bosom in Exodus are linked directly to cannabis. Acacia, repeatedly cited in the Old Testament as shittim wood for the Ark, tabernacle, Aaron's rod, and Solomon's temple, may reflect DMT-containing species like Acacia nilotica and Acacia senegal, supported by parallels in Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and South Arabian ritual use, and comparative evidence of visionary plants in Judaic and Near Eastern ceremonial contexts. Jewish Kabbalah, with its complex tree of Sephiro and multi-layered worlds, also offers a rich cartography that later esotericists and modern psychonauts have used to interpret visionary states, even when no sacrament is involved. The book Cannabis Hasids, the third image from the left on the bottom of the slide, examines historical and ethnobotanical evidence that cannabis served as a sacramental and contemplative aid in early Jewish and Hasidic practice, enhancing prayer, devotion, and communal awareness, while institutionalization likely transformed or suppressed such use in favor of symbolic or meditative forms. In Christian Europe, the Eucharist became the central sacrament of transubstantiation, interpreted as a mystical participation in the body and blood of Christ. And while later interpretations did not rely on psychedelic agents, its theological framing strongly echoed earlier entheogenic motifs of ingesting a consecrated substance to unite with the divine, participating in a sacred drama of death and resurrection, and receiving inner illumination or grace through ritual eating and drinking. In the book The Psychedelic Gospels, author Jerry and Julie Brown argue that early Christianity and the life of Jesus contain evidence of visionary plants and psychoactive mushrooms encoded in medieval art, scripture, and the Gnostic texts, proposing that these entheogens were catalysts for Jesus' revelation of the kingdom of heaven and his sense of divinity and immortality. They trace this idea through anthropological fieldwork in European and Middle Eastern churches, such as the Plain Courant chapel fresco of Adam and Eve with the tree of knowledge of good and evil, represented by mushrooms presumed to be psychedelic, hinting that early consciousness could have been shaped and formed within humanity through the communion with these mind-altering substances. Early Christian leaders condemned entheogenic-related rituals as heretical, redirecting spiritual experience into doctrinally controlled forms, a practice that continued into the Americas, where the church increasingly forced conversion on entheogen-using indigenous groups at the threat of extinction. Similarly, in Vedic India, the widespread ritual use of Soma appears to have been restricted over time by Brahmanic orthodoxy, transforming a once accessible visionary sacrament into a symbolically mediated and highly regulated cultic practice. In this sense, the orthodox suspicion of entheogens reflects a broader anxiety about uncontrolled revelation, about the possibility that individuals might access intense spiritual experiences outside established hierarchies and interpretive frameworks. When modern entheogenic practitioners read scripture, they often notice resonances with their own experiences in passages about being caught up to the third heaven, seeing God face to face, or undergoing a new birth, even if the traditions that preserve those texts ultimately tried to regulate or suppress sacramental chemistry. Medieval visionary mystics, such as Hildegard of Bingen, Meister Eckhart, and later Teresa of Avila and John of the Cross, often described experiences of overwhelming light, union, ego dissolution, and journeys through layered spiritual realms that bear striking phenomenological resemblance to modern psychedelic reports, even though their paths were primarily contemplative, ascetic, and sacramental, rather than confessionally pharmacological. These parallels suggest that once certain regions of consciousness had been mapped by entheogenic or other means, religious traditions could develop non-chemical technologies of prayer, meditation, and ritual that led to similar states, preserving the experiential core while shifting the means. In Sufi Islam, discussions of wine, intoxication, and sobriety in figures like Rumi and Ibn Arabi play a similar double role. On the surface, they refer to metaphorical states of love-drunk union with the divine, yet they likely draw on a broader cultural familiarity with actual intoxication and altered awareness, as documented in the book The Way of the Lover, Sufism, Shamanism, and the Spiritual Art of Love, which acts as a bridge between modern entheogenic and shamanic frameworks and traditional Sufi concepts. In European esoteric, alchemical, and witchcraft traditions, philosophical wines, tinctures, and brews containing psychoactive plants like mandrake, henbane, and nightshade facilitated visionary experience, while inner alchemy reframed these substances as symbols of consciousness refinement, practices that were later suppressed by institutional authorities. As seen in the Chinese history of entheogenic use, inner alchemy reframed these substances as images of inner transformation, so that the elixir became a symbol for refined consciousness, and the stone a metaphor for stabilized realization. In medieval Europe, witches were often depicted as crafting potions and brews containing psychoactive herbs like henbane, nightshade, belladonna, mandrake, and psychoactive mushrooms that enabled visionary experiences and communion with cosmic or spiritual forces. These practices, which fostered direct experiential knowledge outside sanctioned religious authority, became a primary target for persecution by institutional orthodoxy seeking to suppress unsanctioned spiritual power. Practices fostering direct experiential knowledge outside sanctioned authority were persecuted, yet the grammar of ascent, union, and transformation persisted symbolically in mystical and occult frameworks, a pattern echoed today in psychedelic-assisted spirituality, where leaders and clinicians navigate ethical integration and discern genuine insight from novelty or destabilization. It is worth our time to ask ourselves, Why would an institutional religious hierarchy be at odds with entheogenic experience across the world throughout history? The answer is both obvious and occult. As the mysteries of Soma, Haoma, Kykeon, peyote, ayahuasca, Amanita muscaria, and the Dionysian trimma were codified into priestly hierarchies, the inner illumination they provoked threatened the literal and social order, leading Judaism to transform manna and sacred wine into Torah-guided ritual, Christianity to render the Eucharist into bread and wine as symbolic logos, Sufi orders to veil the intoxication of wine in metaphor and zikr, and the Taoist and Vedic rites to cloak psychoactive elixirs in allegorical language, preserving the gnosis while concealing the initiatory ascent from the unprepared masses. In the 16th century, Paracelsian medicine reframed the body as a site of subtle interactions between substance and vital force, blurring the line between alchemy and what would become chemistry. Paracelsus extensively experimented with plants, minerals, and alchemical substances for medicinal and spiritual purposes, and his writing suggests familiarity with psychoactive herbs such as mandrake, henbane, and other vision-inducing plants. In the early modern period, European encounters with psychoactive plants like tobacco, coffee, cacao, and coca shaped medical, social, and esoteric practices, normalizing the idea that chemicals could modulate consciousness. While these substances were not typically psychedelic in the strict sense, their effects on mood, attention, and social ritual helped normalize the idea that chemical agents could powerfully modulate consciousness and behavior. The Florentine Codex, compiled by Bernardino de Sahagún in the 16th century, provided detailed ethnographic accounts of Aztec culture, including extensive documentation of ritual use of entheogens, such as psilocybin mushrooms, or teonanacatl, morning glory seeds, or aloliuqui, and peyote, describing their roles in divination, healing, and spiritual communication. These records reveal that psychoactive plants were integral to religious practice, social regulation, and cosmological understanding, showing that altered states were not recreational, but central to experiential and initiatory dimensions of Mesoamerican spirituality. Occultists and natural philosophers experimented with herbal concoctions, fumes, and tinctures, occasionally stumbling upon more visionary combinations, but generally operating without a clear conceptual distinction between entheogens, poisons, and ordinary medicinal agents. Giambattista della Porta, who lived 1535 to 1615, described nightshade and belladonna effects in Magia Naturalis. Johann Heinrich Cohausen, who lived 1660 to 1724, studied the visionary effects of morning glory seeds in Europe. Later, William Bartram, who lived 1739 to 1823, recorded the psychoactive and ritual use of tobacco and peyote among Native Americans. As the Enlightenment progressed, and with it the rise of experimental science, the study of mind-altering substances moved gradually from the domain of magic and folklore into emerging disciplines such as neurology, psychiatry, and pharmacology. Romantic and symbolist writers such as Thomas de Quincey in 1821, Charles Baudelaire in 1860, and later the members of the fin de siècle occult circles experimented with hashish, opium, and other substances, sometimes treating them as tools for artistic and mystical exploration, and sometimes warning of their dangers. Their writings introduced a broader reading public to the idea that chemical agents could open doors of perception into realms of beauty, terror, and metaphysical insight, even as they also documented addiction, psychological disintegration, and social marginalization. In the same century, 19th century English botanist Richard Spruce conducted pioneering ethnobotanical fieldwork in the Amazon between 1849 and 1864, first documenting the ritual use of ayahuasca in 1851 to 1852, and establishing that visionary plants functioned as sacraments within coherent indigenous cosmologies rather than curiosities. The book Seven Sisters of Sleep, originally published in 1860 by Victorian naturalist Mordecai Cook, is a pioneering survey of the world's most prevalent psychoactive plants and their historical cultural uses, examining tobacco, opium, cannabis, coca, datura, betel nut, and fly agaric across civilizations and eras, providing one of the most comprehensive cross-cultural accounts that influenced later researchers and helped shape the field of ethnobotany and psychoactive study. In the books Alchemically Stoned and Angels in Vermilion, author P.D. Newman proposes a controversial theory that the Masonic symbol of the acacia sprig and related alchemical motifs conceal a connection to entheogenic practice, specifically the extraction and use of dimethyltryptamine, or DMT, from certain acacia species within 18th century alchemically inclined Masonic rites and Egyptian-inspired ceremonies. He links this idea to the broader Hermetic and symbolic tradition in Freemasonry, suggesting that what became framed as allegory or alchemical prima materia may historically point to psychoactive plants as catalysts for visionary experience and spiritual transformation within select esoteric circles. Emerging as offshoots of Freemasonry and earlier Rosicrucianism, esoteric groups and occultists occasionally integrated trance and altered states into ritual, magic, and pathworking, with later figures like Aleister Crowley writing about the use of hashish or cannabis, opium, mescaline, and peyote for mystical experiences in the early 20th century. All of this set the stage for a new era in which psychedelics would be isolated, synthesized, and eventually reimagined as both scientific tools and spiritual sacraments, bringing the ancient entheogenic impulse into direct dialogue with modern psychology and neuroscience. Anthropologist James Mooney studied peyotism among Native American tribes, publishing The Mescal Plant and Ceremony in 1896, and continuing his fieldwork until it was banned in 1918, emphasizing its fusion of indigenous ritual and Christian motifs in contrast to missionary claims of superstition. German chemist Arthur Hefter isolated and identified mescaline from peyote in 1897, building on earlier reports by explorers like Julius Caesar Ewing, and through self-experimentation and chemical study, establishing mescaline as the first naturally occurring psychedelic to be scientifically analyzed. Publishing their findings between 1895 and 1905, early psychologists Havelock Ellis and Wire Mitchell ingested mescaline, analyzing visions and comparing them to dreams or psychosis, setting the tone for decades of Eurocentric psychotomimetic framing, which defined entheogens primarily as tools to induce artificial insanity rather than spiritual illumination. In 1902, William James documented experiments with nitrous oxide and other substances in his book The Varieties of Religious Experience to show altered states could produce mystical insight. Concurrently, the Native American Church coalesced in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, with organizational milestones around 1918 in Oklahoma and 1918 and 1920 among Southern Plains and Southwestern tribes, formalizing peyote's sacramental role in visionary, communal, ethical, and healing practices that fused indigenous shamanic traditions with Christian frameworks. German pharmacologist Louis Lewin, author of Fantastica, published in 1924 in German and 1931 in English, stands as the foundation of Western peyote research, systematically documenting psychoactive plants like peyote, cannabis, fly agaric mushrooms, henbane, datura, and ayahuasca within medical pharmacology, framing peyote as a substance that mediates visionary states rather than mere intoxication, a position that quietly opens space for later spiritual interpretation within psychology, religion, and anthropology. In 1936, Austrian scientific author Victor Recco published his book Magic Poisons, Inebriating and Narcotic Substances of the New World, covering second-hand observations on peyote, ololiuqui or morning glory, ayahuasca, datura, and other drugs not mentioned in the earlier book Fantastica by Louis Lewin. Also in 1936, the book Movers and Shakers by Mabel Dodge Luhan recounts her life among early 20th century avant-garde artists, radicals, and intellectuals in Greenwich Village, and this book includes one of the first Western written accounts of a peyote experience. Indigenous practitioners consistently affirmed peyote as a sacred medium for divine communion and moral renewal, a view largely ignored as mescaline was mapped within a colonial scientific framework that separated chemistry from theology, a divide that shaped 20th century psychedelic research. Mescaline's isolation marked the birth of psychedelic science well before LSD, and was later developed through Heinrich Kluver's analysis of vision-formed constants, Weston LeBar's book The Peyote Cult in 1938, and the philosophical and clinical reframing of mescaline by Aldous Huxley and Humphrey Osmond in the decades to follow. Later still, scholars such as Joseph Campbell and Houston Smith situated peyote within a global and comparative understanding of sacrament and sacred consciousness. Before we move onward, it is important to note, even though it falls outside the realm of mescaline specifically, in 1936, the film Reefer Madness was premiered, and its screening fueled widespread anti-marijuana hysteria across American cities and rural areas throughout the late 1930s and 40s, shaping public perception by linking cannabis and hallucinogenic use to moral decay, crime, and insanity, and influencing early drug prohibition policies nationally. The mid-20th century opened a new epoch in the entheogenic research space through the serendipitous synthesis and discovery of lysergic acid diethylamide, or LSD-25, by Albert Hofmann at Sandoz Laboratories in Basel, Switzerland. Initially developed while researching ergot alkaloids for circulatory aid in 1938, LSD lay dormant until Hofmann's famous self-experiment on April 19, 1943, when what has become known as Bicycle Day revealed its extraordinary psychoactive potency. Hofmann perceived the compound's visionary intensity as a window into the subconscious, describing it as both a chemical key to the psyche and a possible sacramental agent. Prior to 1955, LSD research was initiated largely in Switzerland and Germany, following Albert Hofmann's first intentional self-experiment in 1943, with early clinical and psychiatric studies published by Hofmann, Franz Troxler, and Swiss psychiatrist Ernst Jünger, while Austrian and German psychiatrists such as Kurt Behringer and Heinrich Kluver explored its psychological effects and visual phenomena. Early patients included psychiatric subjects treated at Zurich and Basel hospitals, creative individuals recruited for visionary experiments, and documented case studies in journals like Helvetica Chimica Acta and Experientia, with reports emphasizing alterations in perception, time, emotion, and mystical insight. In 1938, Ernst Spath was the first person to synthesize mescaline in a laboratory, allowing controlled production for pharmacological and experimental use, rather than extraction from the cactus. So while Arthur Hefter discovered and identified mescaline in 1895, Spath enabled its synthetic replication decades later. During the same year in 1938, R. Gordon Wasson began his ethnomycological fieldwork, starting serious field investigations into psychoactive mushrooms in Mexico, initiating what would become the first Western documentation of Mazatec mushroom rituals. In 1945, the first modern studies on psilocybin mushrooms were begun in Mexico, and preliminary chemical isolation work begins on psilocybe species collected during Wasson's expeditions, setting the stage for later laboratory identification of psilocybin and psilocin as the chemical constituents of magic mushrooms. Chemically, psilocybin is biologically inactive until the body converts it into psilocin, which mimics serotonin and binds primarily to the 5-HT2A receptor, making psilocin the compound directly responsible for the psychedelic effects of these psilocybin magic mushrooms. In 1949, early anthropological reporting of ayahuasca is initiated, and Western scholars begin publishing field observations on Amazonian shamanic use of the plants that make up ayahuasca, Banisteriopsis caapi and Psychotria viridis, documenting ritual preparation and visionary effects that would later inform chemical analysis. By the early 1950s, psychiatrists such as Humphrey Osmond, Abram Hoffer, and Stanislav Grof recognized LSD's potential to catalyze transformative mental states. LSD-assisted psychotherapy was framed within two models: the psychotomimetic paradigm, viewing LSD as a model for studying schizophrenia, and the psychedelic psychotherapeutic model, which regarded LSD as a facilitator of mystical, integrative healing. Researchers drew frequent analogies between LSD-induced mystical insight and historical mystical writings, particularly those of Christian mystics, Sufis, and Eastern contemplatives, and Eastern texts like the Tibetan Book of the Dead and the Bhagavad Gita were reinterpreted through new lenses, linking chemical experiences to the perennial mysticism of religious traditions. LSD thus became a bridge between neurochemistry and transcendence, reviving interest in the universality of visionary states described in Upanishadic and Platonic thought. At the same time, psychiatric institutions embedded LSD research within Cold War-era frameworks of mind control, creativity enhancement, and intelligence enhancement, which would later produce ethical controversies. By mid-century, over 1,000 scientific papers and 40,000 patients were treated using LSD, a volume unparalleled in the pre-prohibition period. These early experiments firmly placed LSD at the intersection of modern science and ancient spirituality, reframing entheogens not as exotic curiosities, but as catalysts for exploring human consciousness itself. Aldous Huxley's engagement with mescaline and LSD reframed psychedelic experience as spiritual philosophy rather than physical and mental pathology. In his books The Doors of Perception from 1954 and the sequel Heaven and Hell from 1956, Huxley argued that psychedelics could reduce the cerebral reducing valve, initially hypothesized by Henry Bergson and C.D. Broad, revealing what he termed mind at large, which is a field of universal consciousness accessible in mystical experience. He located this phenomenon within what he termed the perennial philosophy, which Huxley described as a metaphysical framework uniting the mysticism of Christian contemplatives with the mysticism of Hindus, Buddhists, and Sufis. Critics such as R.C. Zahner challenged this view by arguing that chemically induced ecstasy lacked moral depth and sacramental authority. Yet Huxley's writings nonetheless inaugurated the psychedelically inflected perennialism of the 1960s, providing a lasting philosophical bridge between Western esotericism and psychopharmacological modernity. Humphrey Osmond coined the term psychedelic in 1956 during correspondence with Aldous Huxley. The two were trying to come up with a word to replace pathological language like psychotomimetic and hallucinogen by emphasizing substances that manifest the mind rather than induce delirium or psychosis, a conceptual shift that reframed LSD and mescaline within psychology and spirituality. Huxley suggested phanerotime, a word from Greek roots meaning spirit or soul manifesting, and wrote to Humphrey Osmond with his suggestion, including this rhyming tagline: "To make this trivial world sublime, take half a gram of phanerotime." Osmond responded to Huxley's correspondence with the term psychedelic, a word from Greek roots meaning mind manifesting or soul revealing, including his own rhyming tagline: "To fathom hell or soar angelic, just take a pinch of psychedelic." In 1957, Jack Kerouac's book On the Road captured the restless pursuit of freedom, jazz, and cross-country adventure, codifying the Beat Generation's vision of spontaneous, entheogenic-inspired living. Also in 1957, R. Gordon Wasson's Life magazine article titled Seeking the Magic Mushroom introduced a wide Western audience to the living Mazatec ritual, called a velada, and presented psilocybin mushrooms not as curiosities, but as surviving sacraments embedded in an intact ritual cosmology, which quietly altered public assumptions about religion and consciousness. His encounters with the curandera, the native word for healer, named Maria Sabina, mediated through careful participation rather than spectacle, revealed the mushrooms as divine instruments of healing and sacred language, though the later consequences of exposure brought profound disruption to herself and her community, and remain a central ethical lesson in entheogenic history. After Wasson's Life magazine article brought Maria Sabina international attention, numerous famous figures were said to have visited her or make pilgrimage to Oaxaca, Mexico, where Maria Sabina lived, and practiced these mushroom rites, including Bob Dylan, John Lennon, Keith Richards, Allen Ginsberg, Albert Hoffman, Roger Haim, Timothy Leary, and in some unverified accounts, members of the Beatles and other 1960s artists and seekers. Though many celebrity visit claims remain unconfirmed by primary documentation rather than oral or popular lore. Believing Maria Sabina had desecrated her culture's sacred ceremonies by catering to foreigners, the locals imprisoned her, burned down her house, and murdered her son. She died in poverty, ostracized and alone. Sabina's story is a classic tale of the colonial biopiracy of indigenous knowledge and resources. That said, Maria Sabina endures in the historical record as an entheogenic martyr, whose sacrifice opened an immense body of Mazatec ceremonial, botanical, and cosmological knowledge to the wider world. Because of his experiences with Maria Sabina, R. Gordon Wasson, together with his wife Valentina Pavlovna Wasson, trained in ethnomycology and folklore, developed a cross-cultural method tracing sacred mushroom use across Eurasian and Mesoamerican traditions, identifying a global divide between mycophilic, or mushroom-loving, and mycophobic, or mushroom-fearing cultures, shaped by mythology and ritual. Following R. Gordon Wasson's discoveries, Albert Hoffman at Sandoz Laboratories isolated the chemical compounds found in magic mushrooms, psilocybin and psilocin, in 1958, enabling controlled Western research and allowing figures such as Maria Sabina to work with the sacrament beyond seasonal limitations, while simultaneously translating an indigenous mystery into a laboratory context. During a darker chapter between the early 1950s and mid-1960s, the CIA's MKUltra program covertly administered LSD to soldiers, prisoners, psychiatric patients, and civilians in attempts to explore interrogation, behavioral modification, and consciousness control, with documented records indicating over 1,000 soldiers were dosed and many additional subjects affected, though the destruction of files prevents precise accounting. In parallel cultural currents, Lewis Carroll's Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, published in 1865 and popularized through the 1951 Disney adaptation, became a symbolic touchstone for mid-20th century psychedelic culture, where its shifting identities and surreal logic was widely interpreted by artists and psychonauts as allegories of LSD and mescaline-induced alterations of perception within the emerging entheogenic counterculture of the 1950s and 1960s. The 1960s marked the cultural explosion of psychedelics from laboratory curiosities to catalysts of mass spiritual experimentation. The synthesis of LSD from esoteric philosophy and psychiatric science fused with the social upheavals of the decade, where civil rights, anti-war movements, and ecological awakening created a new syncretic spirituality. Figures such as Timothy Leary, Richard Alpert, later known as Ram Dass, and Ralph Metzner emerged as public interpreters of what Leary termed the psychedelic experience, explicitly modeled on the Tibetan Book of the Dead as a practical guide to ego dissolution and psychological rebirth. Through the Concord prison experiment, which reported reduced recidivism in prisoners who had taken psilocybin, the Harvard Psilocybin Project, which frames psychedelics as instruments of behavioral transformation and spiritual inquiry, as well as the Good Friday experiment, conducted by Walter Pahnke under Leary's supervision at Harvard Divinity School, which demonstrated that psilocybin could reliably occasion experiences indistinguishable from classical mystical states within a religious setting. This circle advanced an empirical foundation for entheogenic psychology. Leary developed a developmental and evolutionary model of consciousness, while Ram Dass integrated these insights with Hindu bhakti, Buddhist psychology, and service-oriented mysticism, translating lab findings into enduring frameworks of religious psychology and lived spirituality. This lineage spread through Owsley Stanley's large-scale clandestine manufacture, Ken Kesey's communal distribution that embedded LSD in countercultural ritual, and Humphrey Osmond's early clinical work that legitimized its psychiatric and consciousness research potential. In 1962, Ken Kesey released One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, shaped by his participation in early LSD research, embedding psychedelic critique of authority and consciousness into mainstream American literature. The psychedelic counterculture represented a philosophical and metaphysical revolution, reformulating consciousness as both inner cosmos and social frontier, while drawing deeply from Eastern philosophies like Vedanta, Zen Buddhism, and yoga to interpret the ineffable states induced by LSD, mescaline, and psilocybin. Figures like Alan Watts, in his work The Joyous Cosmology, published 1962, and D.T. Suzuki, supplied a lexicon of non-dual insight that made LSD experiences intelligible as awakenings, not psychoses. Concurrently, Western occult currents, Thelema, Hermeticism, and Jungian alchemy revived among groups pursuing initiatory spirituality outside institutional religion, while communes and intentional psychedelic communities like Millbrook in New York and Esalen Institute in California became laboratories of modern mysticism, integrating entheogenic ritual, ecstatic dance, and esoteric psychology into cohesive programs of inner transformation. From 1965 to 1968, entheogenic ideas permeated literature, culture, and scholarship. Frank Herbert's Dune, published in 1965, portrayed the spice melange as a sacrament, granting expanded perception and prophetic vision. The 1967 San Francisco Human Being was an event that fused LSD, political rebellion, and religious syncretism into the counterculture ethos of turn on, tune in, drop out. Richard Evans Schultes, working from the late 1930s through the 1970s, rigorously documented peyote, ayahuasca, and other entheogens, culminating in his book Hallucinogenic Plants of the New World, published in 1967. Star Trek episodes between 1966 and 1969 explored consciousness expansion themes. 1968 saw the publishing of R. Gordon Wasson's book Soma, The Divine Mushroom of Immortality, hypothesizing the identity of the Hindu Soma as Amanita muscaria mushrooms. The year also saw the production of psychedelic films like Joe Massett's Wonderwall and the Beatles' Yellow Submarine, which translated entheogenic knowledge into literature, film, religion, and popular culture. 1968 also saw the publication of The Teachings of Don Juan by author Carlos Castaneda, a seminal book on his apprenticeship with a Yaqui shaman stemming from his alleged experiences with Don Juan Matus between 1960 and 1965. It was submitted as his master's thesis in anthropology and details Castaneda's journey into shamanism and altered states, becoming a major counterculture phenomenon. Although formed in the mid-1950s, the term psychedelic only gained widespread cultural adoption in the late 1960s, and its original formulation grounded entheogenic experience in clarity, meaning, and insight, shaping both scientific discourse and the emerging philosophy of consciousness studies. Throughout the 1960s, musicians such as Jerry Garcia, Jimi Hendrix, Carlos Santana, the Beatles, Pink Floyd, Jefferson Airplane, and the Grateful Dead translated LSD consciousness into improvisational music, extended performance, and symbolic lyricism, normalizing entheogenic states across youth culture. The Woodstock Music and Art Fair in 1969 in Bethel, New York, functioned as a public rite of passage for entheogenic practitioners by normalizing psychedelic experience as a collective cultural phenomenon linked to music, peace, and communal identity. Simultaneously, tensions arose through spiritual appropriation and guru dependency, exemplified by Charles Manson's LSD-influenced communes in the late 1960s in California. By the decade's end, public fascination and governmental suspicion highlighted LSD's dual role in mystical revival and moral panic, establishing enduring Western motifs of ego dissolution, drugs as sacraments, and the integration of global spiritual vocabularies into modern religiosity and the New Age movement. Moving onward to the 1970s, on June 12th of 1970, Doc Ellis, a pitcher for the Pittsburgh Pirates, pitched a no-hitter while tripping on LSD, seeing kaleidoscopic patterns and hallucinating that the catcher was a person in a red dress, a story detailed in the documentary No, a Documentary. Ellis pitched a complete game, walking 8 and striking out 6 against the San Diego Padres, a performance that cemented his legacy and highlighted his struggles with addiction, becoming a famous tale of a pitcher's altered state, creating one of baseball's most unbelievable stories. In the early 1970s, in Southern California, John Griggs, founder of the Brotherhood of Eternal Love, took a vial of LSD from an underground chemist within the West Coast Psychedelic Network, then returned it the next day after realizing through direct experience the immense spiritual gravity and responsibility bound to its distribution. The episode has since become a cautionary yet emblematic moment in entheogenic history, revealing how the counterculture was beginning to move from reckless bravado toward a more ethically grounded understanding of sacramental psychedelics as forces that demand reverence rather than exploitation. However, these examples were overshadowed by a dark period in entheogenic history. The explosive rise of entheogens in the 1960s provoked an equally powerful political and cultural backlash. Concerns over youth radicalization, moral decay, and social instability intertwined with Cold War anxieties, which led to sweeping legal prohibitions. Between 1970 and 1971, the U.S. Controlled Substances Act, passed under President Nixon, categorized LSD, psilocybin, mescaline, and DMT as Schedule I substances, declared to have no accepted medical use, despite abundant therapeutic evidence. Internationally, the 1971 UN Convention on Psychotropic Substances institutionalized global criminalization, freezing psychedelic research for nearly 3 decades. This suppression did not eradicate entheogenic practice, rather it drove it underground, influencing a variety of clandestine and semi-public traditions. From the 1950s through the 1970s, author and counterculture icon Hunter S. Thompson became a central figure in entheogenic history through works like Fear and Loathing in Las Vegas, published in 1971, and Fear and Loathing on the Campaign Trail, published in 1973, which fused reportage with heavy use of LSD, mescaline, cannabis, and other substances to critique the excess, paranoia, and moral exhaustion of late 20th century American society. During the same period, visionary painters Ernst Fuchs and Matti Klarwein gave psychedelic culture its enduring symbolic language through archetypal, ecstatic, and cosmological imagery that visually mapped the interior landscapes disclosed by entheogenic states. From the 60s through the 70s, American physician, neuroscientist, philosopher, writer, and inventor John C. Lilly explored consciousness through LSD, ketamine, and DMT, chronicling his findings in his books Programming and Metaprogramming the Human Biocomputer from 1968 and The Center of the Cyclone from 1972. John C. Lilly invented sensory deprivation tanks and developed projects that attempted to foster interspecies communication with dolphins through the use of agents like LSD, testing whether mind could transcend both bodily isolation and species boundaries. In the early 70s, Chilean-French movie director Alejandro Jodorowsky produced films El Topo in 1970 and The Holy Mountain in 1973, which translated alchemical, mystical, and entheogenic symbolism into visionary cinema, capturing the inner journeys of consciousness expansion. The father of modern ethnobotany and the executive director of Harvard's Botanical Museum, Richard Evans Schultes, co-authored The Botany and Chemistry of Hallucinogens with the chemist who discovered LSD, Albert Hofmann, in 1973, and later Plants of the Gods in 1979, translating decades of field research into a scholarly canon that established entheogenic plants as legitimate subjects in anthropology, pharmacology, and comparative religion. In 1975, psychiatrist Stanislav Grof published Realms of the Human Unconscious, recording research studies and case histories of LSD sessions and experiences. From 1975 to 1980, American writer, futurist, psychologist, and self-described agnostic mystic Robert Anton Wilson popularized psychedelic consciousness through metaphysical satire and conspiratorial science fiction, with works like the Illuminatus trilogy co-authored with Robert Shea and the Cosmic Trigger trilogy. 1978 saw Philip K. Dick's book Valis explore visionary and Gnostic states, alongside The Road to Eleusis by Wasson, Hoffman, and Ruck, proposing an entheogenic Kykeon in the Eleusinian mysteries. Anthropologist Michael Harner founded the Center for Shamanic Studies in 1979, which was later incorporated and renamed the Foundation for Shamanic Studies in 1987, to preserve and teach shamanic knowledge, transitioning from his academic career to focus full-time on this mission. Throughout the 1970s, Harner began shifting from traditional anthropology to experiential shamanism, conducting research in the Amazon and experimenting with drumming to induce altered states, leading to his development of core shamanism, a practical system for connecting with spirit worlds, famously detailed in his 1980 book, The Way of the Shaman. In 1979, largely attributed to American author and ethnobotanist Jonathan Ott, the term entheogen was coined alongside scholars Carl Ruck, Jeremy Bigwood, Danny Staples, and R. Gordon Wasson, specifically to differentiate the spiritual use of these substances from their recreational use. In the 1970s, Alexander Shulgin conducted pioneering research on MDMA, synthesizing and bioassaying the compound to reveal profound psychoactive and empathogenic effects, laying the foundation for its later use in psychotherapy and experimental consciousness studies. Throughout the 1970s and 80s, psychedelics persisted in North American and European countercultural microclimates, including intentional communes, occult lodges, art scenes, and early precursors to festivals like Burning Man, where visionary experience was treated as initiatory and aesthetic revelation. The Prohibition era paradoxically sacralized entheogenic practice, framing users as heretics and mystics, and giving rise to secret initiations and inner circles, preserving gnosis and secret knowledge, all while underground therapists quietly administered psychedelic therapy. European esoteric orders, including Thelemic, Hermetic, Theosophical, and emerging chaos magic groups, integrated psychedelics into mystical theurgy as sacramental tools rather than objects of scientific study. Academic research receded, yet underground ritual persisted, and the 1970s redefined psychedelics as symbols of resistance, reflecting broader countercultural critiques of technocratic society. On to the 1980s. While Western prohibition took hold, indigenous and syncretic movements continued to affirm entheogenic ritual as sacramental law and theological practice. Between 1980 and 1989, the entheogenic religious landscape saw significant global developments, marked by scholarship, legal recognition, and cultural expression. In 1980, Albert Hofmann published LSD My Problem Child, formally situating lysergic acid diethylamide, or LSD, within its scientific origins at Sandoz in Switzerland, and reclaiming the compound from sensationalism. Also in 1980, American scholar R. Gordon Wasson's book, The Wondrous Mushroom, and Czech psychiatrist Stanislav Grof's book, LSD Psychotherapy, together formalized both the anthropological and clinical foundations of entheogenic research by documenting sacramental mushroom traditions alongside rigorously observed psychedelic LSD clinical therapy. Also in 1980, the Native American Church gained federal recognition in the United States, legally protecting peyote use in religious ceremonies, exempting it from Schedule I restrictions. As mentioned earlier, but important to reiterate for clarity, within the Native American Church, peyote functions as sacrament and divine mediator, enabling moral purification, healing, and communion with the Great Spirit through ritual, prayer, and disciplined practice, grounded in syncretic Christo-indigenous theology. Simultaneously, Brazil's 20th century ayahuasca churches, notably Santo Daime and União do Vegetal, develop unique Christian ayahuascan cosmologies, merging Amazonian indigenous entheogenic practice, called vegetalismo, with folk Catholicism and Spiritism. These communities envision ayahuasca, called Daime or Huasca, as a divine being or queen of the forest, facilitating moral illumination and collective healing. Each church codified doctrines, iconography, and liturgy centered around ingestion of the brew, transforming indigenous shamanic practice into structured religious institutions with hymnals, hierarchies, and sacraments. Legal battles surrounding these movements reshaped entheogenic jurisprudence. It was not until later decades, in 2006, that the U.S. Supreme Court unanimously upheld União do Vegetal's right to use ayahuasca under the Religious Freedom Restoration Act, a landmark recognition of entheogens as constitutionally protected sacraments. Santo Daime achieved similar rulings in Brazil and parts of Europe, establishing international precedents balancing freedom of religion, public health, and indigenous autonomy. The legal recognition of such practices signifies a subtle re-enchantment of modern law, legitimizing spiritual ecologies long dismissed by colonial rationality. Through these churches, indigenous and mestizo lineages asserted that healing and revelation are inseparable from reciprocity with nature, marking a profound re-indigenization of the global entheogenic imagination. The 1980s witnessed the rise of ayahuasca tourism and ceremonial practice in the Amazon, driven by local shamans in Peru and Colombia, and popularized by figures such as Colombian anthropologist Luis Eduardo Luna and American biologist Richard Evans Schultes. This period facilitated increased cross-cultural exchange of visionary plant knowledge between indigenous practitioners and international visitors. The emergence of these ceremonies helped establish ayahuasca as both a spiritual and ethnobotanical phenomenon beyond its traditional context. In visual arts and media, Alex Gray began exhibiting sacred mirrors in 1983, translating LSD and DMT-inspired visionary states into widely influential paintings. In 1983, Terence McKenna released Food of the Gods research lectures that later crystallized into his 1992 book, but whose core ideas on psilocybin evolution and Amazonian shamanism circulated widely through lectures in California and Hawaii during the 1980s. In 1985, MDMA was placed into Schedule I categorization by the government in the United States, following its therapeutic use in California and Texas psychotherapy during the 1980s. Burning Man started in 1986, when Larry Harvey and Jerry James burned a wooden effigy of a man on Baker Beach in San Francisco, a small gathering that has since grown into the large annual desert festival held in Nevada's Black Rock Desert. The event began as a small summer solstice bonfire, but evolved into its current form after police intervened in 1990, leading to its relocation in the desert. Also in 1986, the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, or MAPS, was founded in 1986 by Rick Doblin to research and promote the therapeutic potential of psychedelic substances, initiating a modern era of psychedelic science. Additionally, in 1986, American psychiatrist Rick Strassman received preliminary approval for future DMT research that would later culminate in his book The Spirit Molecule, published in 2001. Published in 1988, Czech psychiatrist Stanislav Grof's book, The Adventure of Self-Discovery, synthesized decades of research on LSD psychotherapy and non-ordinary states, framing them as instruments for spiritual growth, psychological insight, and transpersonal exploration. These years also witnessed ongoing research into psychedelic psychotherapy with MDMA and LSD in Switzerland and the United Kingdom, setting the stage for the clinical resurgence that occurred in the 1990s. The late 20th and early 21st centuries saw the psychedelic renaissance as organizations such as MAPS, seen on the last slide, as well as research centers at Johns Hopkins, Imperial College London, and NYU, reignited controlled studies of psilocybin, LSD, MDMA, ibogaine, and ayahuasca, framing them as therapeutic agents for depression, PTSD, and addiction. Researchers such as American psychopharmacologist Roland Griffiths, Robin Carhart Harris, and Charles Grobe highlighted the role of mystical type experiences in positive therapeutic outcomes. Quantitative scales, such as the Mystical Experience Questionnaire, or MEQ, based on William James and Walter Stace, formalized spiritual phenomenology into empirical metrics. Within this scientific lexicon, terms like ego dissolution, transcendence, and sacred encounter were reinterpreted as clinical correlates of existential well-being and meaning-making. In 1990, in the case Employment Division v. Smith, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that states could constitutionally prohibit all use of peyote, including ceremonial use by Native Americans, under generally applicable criminal laws, finding that the First Amendment did not require religious exemptions. This decision removed constitutional protection and created a crisis of religious persecution for Native American church members in some states, which led to the 1994 American Indian Religious Freedom Act amendments, explicitly protecting ceremonial peyote use. Czech psychiatrist Stanislav Grof published his book The Holotropic Mind in 1992, consolidating decades of LSD psychotherapy and non-ordinary state research into a comprehensive framework for understanding consciousness, spiritual emergence, and transpersonal psychology. Also in 1992, American philosopher and ethnobotanist Terence McKenna published his book Food of the Gods, A Radical History of Plants, Drugs, and Human Evolution, which popularized entheogenic and ethnobotanical perspectives through McKenna's Counterculture Manifesto on mind-altering drugs and hallucinogens throughout global history, advocating for their responsible use grounded in entheogenic education. In 1993, botanical researcher Jonathan Ott published Pharmacotheon, synthesizing ethnobotanical, chemical, and historical research to document global psychoactive plant use, establishing entheogens as central to spiritual practice, ritual initiation, and visionary traditions, and framing concepts like ego dissolution, transcendence, and sacred encounter as clinical correlates of existential well-being. Alexander Shulgin, best known for introducing MDMA to psychopharmacological research and therapy in the late 1970s, profoundly shaped entheogenic history through his creation, bioassay, and publication of novel psychoactive compounds, most notably in P-Call in 1991 and T-Call in 1997, building on his 1960s through 70s work with MDMA, DOM, and other phenethylamines and tryptamines that provided researchers and psychonauts unprecedented insight into chemistry, subjective effects, and spiritual potential. MDMA, now known as ecstasy, is not traditionally entheogenic, but it did expand psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. Counterculture icon and ousted Harvard professor Timothy Leary published his books Chaos and Cyberculture in 1994 and Evolutionary Agents in 1995, which emphasized the use of psychedelics, cybernetics, and digital technology as tools for accelerating consciousness expansion. They also explored entheogenic experience as a mechanism for personal and collective transformation in a rapidly emerging cyber-cultural landscape. Artist Alex Gray founded the Chapel of Sacred Mirrors, COSM, in 1996 as a non-profit to create a permanent exhibition for his works and a psychedelic space for meditation. In 1998, Alex Proyas released Dark City, a film infused with psychedelic and Gnostic ideas, influencing entheogenically coded science fiction cinema. Also in 1998, Canadian anthropologist Jeremy Narby published The Cosmic Serpent, bridging molecular biology and shamanic knowledge by proposing ayahuasca visions encode DNA-level information, profoundly influencing entheogenic discourse on the intersection of indigenous wisdom, consciousness, and the natural sciences. In 1999, American psychologist Ralph Metzner published his book Ayahuasca, Human Consciousness, and the Spirits of Nature, which profoundly influenced entheogenic history by framing ayahuasca as a catalyst for cross-cultural spiritual insight, ecological awareness, and experiential engagement with non-human intelligences, integrating shamanic cosmology into modern consciousness studies. Throughout the decade, ayahuasca and ibogaine entered Western medical anthropology as complex ethnopharmacological systems, both sacrament and medicine, embedded in indigenous cosmologies of healing. This interdisciplinary revival united neuroscience, anthropology, and spiritual care, producing hybrid frameworks now discussed in terms such as psychedelic chaplaincy, existential medicine, and integrative psychiatry. The new science of psychedelics thus represents both a technical and metaphysical reawakening, a scientific pursuit of what Huxley called the mind at large, renamed as the default mode network, a large-scale brain network active during rest, daydreaming, and introspection, involved in self-reflection, memory, and thinking about others, but becomes less active during focused tasks. Throughout the 1990s, the entheogenic lexicon returned to medicine, but clothed in language acceptable to the academy, with spirituality as measure and transcendence as data. Between 2000 and 2010, key literary publications defined the era. American philosopher and ethnobotanist author Terence McKenna had his influence increase after his death in the year 2000. Also in 2000, American scholar of religious studies Houston Smith published Cleansing the Doors of Perception, providing a rigorous cross-cultural framework that reframes psychedelic experience as legitimate encounters with the sacred, rather than mere psychopathology, helping reestablish entheogens as serious subjects within theology, philosophy of religion, and comparative mysticism. Also in 2000, the book Entheogens and the Future of Religion, edited by American author Robert Forte, argued that sacramental plants and visionary substances, documented from Eleusis to the Americas, constitute a perennial channel through which humans access transcendent states, and that the responsible integration into contemporary worship could reshape future religious life by relinking ritual experience with direct encounter of the sacred, rather than abstract belief. In 2001, Ralph Metzner published his book Green Psychology, which advanced entheogenic history by linking psychedelic experience to ecological consciousness, proposing that altered states foster a direct experiential understanding of humanity's interconnectedness with nature and the planet's living systems. Also in 2001, American psychiatrist Rick Strassman published his book DMT, the Spirit Molecule, shaping entheogenic history by rigorously documenting the phenomenology, neurobiology, and potential spiritual significance of dimethyltryptamine or DMT, framing the compound as a scientific bridge between pharmacology and direct mystical experience. In 2002, psychology professor Benny Shannon published his book Antipodes of the Mind, which influenced entheogenic history by exploring the intersection of neuroscience, consciousness, and psychedelics, offering a framework that connected altered states with cognitive and mystical processes, thereby bridging experimental research with experiential insight. Cultural milestones included the global spread of visionary art festivals in the early 2000s, Burning Man's rise as an entheogenic spiritual laboratory by the mid-2000s, and the development of psytrance as a ritualized musical movement between 2000 and 2010. In 2001, the film Waking Life introduced psychedelic metaphysics to global audiences, while MAPS expanded MDMA and psilocybin research, coinciding with the normalization of the term entheogen in academic journals, and the reintegration of psychedelics into Western mystical and ceremonial practice between 2004 and 2007. Canadian anthropologist Jeremy Narby's influence grew following The Cosmic Serpent, published in 1998, with the sequel Intelligence in Nature, published in 2005. Film director and author Alejandro Jodorowsky saw renewed influence through retrospectives and writings after 2005, with his Holy Mountain film from 1973 finding new resonance with entheogenic audiences. In 2006, American psychopharmacologist Roland Griffiths and colleagues at Johns Hopkins published the landmark double-blind study, Psilocybin Can Occasion Mystical Type Experiences Having Substantial and Sustained Personal Meaning and Spiritual Significance, marking the first modern-era controlled laboratory demonstration of enduring spiritual effects from a classic psychedelic. Renewed attention to ancient sacramental traditions was strengthened by interdisciplinary work in archaeology, classics, and philology that continued the trajectory opened by Wasson, Hoffman, and Ruck. Also in 2006, the film The Fall by director Tarsum Singh gained significance in entheogenic history because its richly layered visuals, mythic narrative, and dreamlike interplay between inner psyche and outer world evoke the symbolic logic of visionary states associated with substances like LSD and ayahuasca, influencing artists, psychonauts, and cultural theorists who see it as a cinematic analog for the dissolution of ordinary perception and the emergence of archetypal imagery found across cultures. In 2008, Harvard Associate Professor of Psychiatry and Anthropology, Barbara Lex, and medical anthropologist Michael Winkelmann expanded cross-cultural and neuroscientific analyses of shamanism and altered states. 2008 also saw the posthumous publication of R. Gordon Wasson's essays, consolidating the entheogenic paradigm, situating entheogenic experience within law, neuroscience, indigenous sovereignty, religious studies, and contemporary art, rather than counterculture alone. By 2009, the film Enter the Void premiered at Cannes and released theatrically in 2010, visually conveying entheogenic aesthetics to a curious public audience. By 2009 and 2010, Johns Hopkins and NYU research teams initiated the next generation of FDA-approved psilocybin studies for end-of-life anxiety and depression, with protocols approved and early results presented at academic conferences, formally re-anchoring entheogenic experience within clinical science, psychology of religion, and consciousness studies. Also in 2009, the decade saw a revival of ayahuasca research in Brazil and Spain, with a growing global dialogue between neuroscience, mysticism, and sacramental law that re-legitimized entheogens as vehicles of religious experience. Oregon-based artist Timothy White's visionary artwork, developed primarily from the 2000s onward, translates entheogenic and mystical experiences into luminous cosmic and archetypal imagery, shaping contemporary psychedelic art and influencing the global perception of altered states through exhibitions, publications, and multimedia platforms. We are nearly to the now. From 2010 onward, academic entheogenic research entered a new era of rigor and global recognition. In 2010, American psychopharmacologist Roland Griffiths and his team at Johns Hopkins published long-term follow-up studies on psilocybin, demonstrating persistent changes in personality, mood, and spiritual well-being, establishing a model for psychedelics as tools for sustained psychological and mystical transformation. Between 2011 and 12, Professor of Psychiatry Matthew Johnson and clinical psychologist William Richards contributed key studies on dose response and safety profiles for psilocybin in healthy volunteers and mediators, formalizing protocols that would guide modern psychedelic therapy. In this decade, the world saw the revival of what is known as Gaian consciousness, with humanity intimately connected to the living processes of the earth, brought to life by the public internalization of Terence McKenna's later expansion of the ideological foundation created by James Lovelock in the 1970s. Contemporary discourse emphasizes decolonization and reciprocity, calling for ethical engagement with indigenous knowledge and sacred ecologies. Movements such as Decriminalize Nature articulate spiritual sovereignty while promoting local plant conservation and community ceremony. Meanwhile, institutions like the Chacruna Institute champion intercultural governance models for entheogenic practice, envisioning global ethics that unify science, spirituality, and law. The integration of psychedelic chaplaincy within clinical and interfaith settings signifies an emerging entheogenic ministry, where trained facilitators bridge spiritual care and psychological healing, grounding mystical experience in ethical frameworks. Here, entheogens have re-emerged as central to planetary spirituality and ecological ethics. The convergence of decriminalization movements, interfaith dialogue, and environmental crisis has generated a new theological paradigm, eco-entheogenic spirituality. By 2014, Robin Carhart Harris and colleagues at Imperial College London initiated neuroimaging studies with psilocybin, demonstrating altered default mode network connectivity and correlating brain activity with subjective mystical experience, marking a crucial intersection of neuroscience and entheogenic spirituality. In 2016, Griffiths et al. Published clinical studies on psilocybin-assisted therapy for cancer-related anxiety and depression in the Journal of Psychopharmacology, showing rapid and enduring reductions in existential distress. From 2017 through 19, multiple landmark studies emerged. NYU and Johns Hopkins expanded psilocybin research into treatment-resistant depression and obsessive-compulsive disorder, while ongoing DMT studies examined phenomenology, neurobiology, and endogenous roles, including Strassman-inspired protocols for clinical observation. Scholars such as philosophy and religious studies professor Christopher Bach, American author Robert Forte, and psychedelic psychotherapist Rachel Harris examined extended psychedelic practice as initiatory discipline, reframing the sacred as process rather than fixed creed. In 2020, American lawyer and psychedelic scholar Brian Murarescu published his book The Immortality Key, which argued that early Mediterranean mystery cults, including Eleusis and early Christianity, incorporated psychoactive sacramental plants, such as ergot and other psychedelics, drawing on ancient texts, chemical analysis of residues from antiquity, and comparative ritual evidence to suggest that altered states of consciousness shaped foundational religious experiences across the classical world. During this decade, at the collective level, ecology itself becomes the new temple. The forest, the ayahuasca vine, and the mushroom are understood as instructors in planetary interdependence. This synthesis of spiritual ecology, neurotheology, and post-secular mysticism points toward a future where entheogens serve as mediators between human consciousness and biospheric intelligence. Where early modernity sought transcendence through heaven, contemporary entheogenic spirituality seeks immanence through earth. In this integrative vision, entheogens are not instruments of escape, but catalysts for reconnection, reconciliation, and regenerative spirituality, guiding the species toward a more conscious participation in the living cosmos. Modern neuroscience has shown certain entheogenic compounds, including psilocybin and DMT analogs, stimulate neurogenesis and synaptogenesis in the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex, meaning they measurably increase the growth of new neurons and neural connections, a process long associated in contemplative traditions with the awakening of higher or solar consciousness within the mind. In conclusion, the history of entheogenic plants reveals a persistent and transformative thread running through human spiritual experience across cultures and centuries. From the ritual mushrooms and acacias of ancient Egypt and the Americas, to ayahuasca, peyote, and psilocybin in indigenous and syncretic practices, and extending into modern clinical, artistic, and visionary contexts. These substances have consistently served as tools for accessing altered states, connecting the individual with the cosmos, facilitating initiation, and reshaping consciousness, while inspiring scholarship, art, and legal recognition around the world. By tracing their use from prehistory to the present, we see that entheogens are not mere curiosities or recreational agents, but central instruments in humanity's ongoing exploration of the sacred, the self, and the boundaries of perception. As research, ritual, and cultural integration continue, entheogenic plants remain pivotal in bridging science, spirituality, and art, offering profound insight into both the history of human consciousness and the future of global religious experience. Some of the sources are located on screen, but if you would like a video showing all of the sources, visit our social media and find a video titled Spiritual Books for a Spiritual Search Part 6, seen at the bottom of the slide. And there you will find hundreds of books on entheogenic or psychedelic science and religion. Thank you for your time.